A blood-curdling scream ripped through the quiet morning air. Karen jolted upright, clutching the thin fabric of her tent. Her heart hammered against her ribs, every pulse echoing the terrified shriek. It couldn't be. Not here. Not in this peaceful haven, she discovered after weeks of searching for the perfect camping spot. A place seemingly untouched, nestled by the shimmering expanse of the lake. Peeking cautiously through the tent flap, Karen noticed figures moving in the distance, silhouetted against the rising sun. Two enormous, muscular dogs prowled the perimeter of her campsite, their low growls a chilling symphony that sent shivers down her spine. Panic welled up inside her. Those weren't the playful retrievers she sometimes spotted on her suburban walks. These were beasts. Guard dogs. Their menacing presence screamed danger, and the raw fear in their eyes sent a clear message. Trespassers were not welcome. As she scrambled back into the relative safety of her tent, her gaze landed on the crumpled HOA newsletter she'd used to start last night's campfire. Her eyes widened as a chilling realization washed over her. This wasn't some unclaimed slice of paradise. This land belonged to someone. And those dogs, they were just the welcoming committee. The name on the newsletter screamed in bold, stark letters. Asterisk, asterisk, HARRISONBLACK. Asterisk, asterisk. Karen vaguely remembered seeing the name on a faded wooden sign as she'd driven down the long, unpaved road to the clearing. She'd been too enamored by the picturesque view to pay it much attention. Harrison Black. The name had an ominous ring to it, like a warning whispered on the wind. What kind of man had guard dogs like that? Dogs that looked more wolf than domesticated pet. A low growl resonated from just outside her tent, followed by the distinct sound of claws scraping against nylon. Karen stifled a gasp and scrambled back, clutching her sleeping bag for dear life. She could practically feel the heat of their breath on the thin fabric, smell the primal musk of their fur. She had to get out of there. Now. But the entrance to her tent was blocked by those monstrous dogs, their imposing figures like statues carved from darkness and menace. Suddenly, a deep voice cut through the tense silence. Well, well, well. What do we have here? Karen froze, her breath caught in her throat. The voice was deep, gravelly, and laced with an icy amusement that sent chills down her spine. Slowly, she peered out from the tent flap, her eyes widening as they fell upon the stranger standing just beyond the imposing forms of the guard dogs. He was tall and rugged, with a weathered face that spoke of years spent under the sun. A worn Stetson shadowed his eyes, but Karen could feel the weight of his gaze upon her. In his hand, he held a worn leather leash, the other end disappearing into the darkness beyond the dogs. He hadn't needed to restrain them. They obeyed his silent command. I do believe you're on my property, ma'am, the man drawled, a hint of steel creeping into his voice. Mind telling me what you're doing here? Fear tightened its grip on Karen's throat, but she forced herself to speak. I didn't realize, she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. This place is so beautiful. I thought it was unclaimed. The man chuckled, a humorless sound that echoed the rustling leaves of the surrounding woods. Unclaimed, he repeated, taking a step closer. The dogs moved with him, their bodies a silent, watchful presence. Ma'am, out here, nothing's unclaimed. And everything has teeth. Karen shrank back, his words hitting her like a slap. Teeth, she echoed, her gaze darting between the man and the imposing figures of his dogs. The reality of her situation crashed down on her. She was alone, trespassing on this man's land, at the mercy of him and his intimidating companions. Desperate for a way out, Karen fell back on her usual tactics. Do you know who I am? She blurted out, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and indignation. I'm Karen, and I'm on the HOA board. We don't tolerate this kind of her voice faltered as she searched for the right word, aggression towards our members. The man's face remained impassive. Aggression, he repeated, raising an eyebrow. Ma'am, You're the one trespassing. On my land. With that ridiculous floral tent. He nodded towards her brightly patterned shelter with a dismissive smirk. Karen bristled at his dismissive tone. This is a very expensive tent, she retorted, her voice rising in anger. But even as the words left her mouth, she realized how absurd they sounded. What did it matter how expensive her tent was? She was at this man's mercy, and he clearly didn't care for HOA regulations, expensive tents, or entitled women named Karen. As his silence stretched, a slow, knowing smile spread across his face. Well, Karen from the HOA, he finally drawled, it seems we have a lot to discuss. Karen wanted to disappear, swallowed whole by the whispering woods surrounding them. The man's smile didn't reach his eyes, and the heavy silence that followed his last words was more unsettling than the dog's growls. What do you want? Karen choked out, her voice barely above a whisper. She knew she was on the defensive, but years of wielding the HOA rulebook like a weapon had conditioned her to negotiate from a position of power. Even now, facing down a man who seemed carved from the very wilderness itself, that instinct kicked in. He took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. The dogs mirrored his movement, a silent ballet of menace. What I want, he said, his voice low and steady, is for you to explain why I shouldn't call the sheriff and have you cited for trespassing. Karen felt a wave of relief. This she could handle. The road, she blurted out, grasping at straws, it wasn't marked clearly, and there was no gate. He tilted his head, amusement flickering in his eyes. So, you admit you trespassed? Her mind raced. She had to regain control. Look, she began, forcing a confident tone, I'm sure we can resolve this civilly. How about I just pack up, and we forget this whole thing ever happened? He didn't reply, but the silence stretched, thick with unspoken possibilities. Finally, he leaned down and with a swift motion, unclipped the leashes from his dog's collars. Karen's blood ran cold. Karen's breath hitched in her throat, her eyes glued to the now free dogs. They hadn't attacked, but stood still as statues, their dark eyes fixed on her with unsettling intensity. The air crackled with a silent tension that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. What are you doing? She stammered, her voice thin and reedy. The man, Harrison, didn't answer. He simply stepped aside, gesturing with his hand towards the path leading back to the dirt road. You said you wanted to pack up and forget this happened, he said, his voice deceptively mild. The way is clear. His words were an invitation and a threat all at once. Karen knew she had pushed him too far, misjudged the situation entirely. This wasn't a dispute she could win with HOA bylaws or a condescending tone. This man operated by a different set of rules, a primal code written in the ancient language of the land itself. Trembling, she fumbled for the zipper of her tent, her fingers clumsy with fear. The dogs watched her every move, their silence more unnerving than any growl. Every rustle of leaves, every chirp of a distant bird, sounded amplified in the charged silence. It was as though the forest itself held its breath, waiting to see what she would do. With shaking hands, Karen managed to dismantle her tent, shoving it haphazardly into its bag. Her movements were jerky, frantic. Every second felt like an eternity under the watchful gaze of Harrison and his imposing companions. Pride, usually her shield and weapon, lay shattered, replaced by a raw, primal fear she had never known. Harrison hadn't moved, his posture relaxed yet commanding. He reminded her of a predator, toying with his prey, though whether he intended to unleash his dogs or simply saber her fear, she couldn't tell. This unsettling uncertainty gnawed at her, worse than any open aggression. As she slung the heavy bag over her shoulder, a wave of dizziness hit her. The encounter had shaken her more deeply than she cared to admit. She stumbled, dropping the bag with a thud that echoed through the clearing. Before she could even think about retrieving it, one of the dogs moved. It wasn't the lunge she expected, the attack she'd braced for. Instead, the massive creature nudged the bag gently with its nose, pushing it closer to her feet. A low whine escaped its throat, a sound that, surprisingly, held no menace. It was almost apologetic. Karen stared at the dog, then up at Harrison, her confusion evident. He met her gaze, a hint of something like amusement dancing in his eyes. "Don't worry," he said, his voice losing some of its previous steel. "They're just making sure you don't forget anything." Karen stared at Harrison, his words slowly sinking in. Were they a joke? A strange attempt at hospitality after holding her hostage with his canine henchman? She couldn't tell. This entire encounter had stripped away her carefully constructed facade, leaving her feeling exposed and vulnerable. She glanced down at the dog, its dark eyes staring up at her. The intensity of its gaze was still unnerving, but the early regression had vanished, replaced by something akin to concern. It was absurd, she knew, to anthropomorphize a creature clearly bred for power and protection. Yet, there was an intelligence in those eyes that belied its intimidating exterior. Straightening her shoulders, Karen forced a shaky laugh. "Right," she said, her voice still trembling slightly. "Wouldn't want to leave a mess, would we?" It was a weak attempt at regaining some semblance of control, but it was the best she could manage at that moment. Bending down, she hefted the tent bag onto her shoulder, surprised by the unexpected gesture from the dog. It felt different now, leaving. She wasn't just retreating, she was acknowledging defeat. And in that moment of humbling realization, a flicker of something new sparked within her. A grudging respect for the man and his unconventional domain. Without another word, Karen turned and walked towards the path, the two dogs flanking her like furry, silent guardians. As she reached the edge of the clearing, she glanced back to see Harrison watching her, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. And for the first time that day, Karen felt a flicker of something other than fear, the unsettling, intriguing possibility of wanting to see that smile again.